baby, I know stories to be told, but I've heard one of them think of me. That's the good. Make it more. Because of your mind to be, and almost had it all. Because of your leave me where I can't help you. We could have had it all, rolling in the deep. You had my heart and soul in your hands, but you made it to the beat. Rolling in the deep. You had my heart and soul in your hands, but you made it to the beat.
that crane area, please move out. Please don't sit near it because when the crane swings, you're going to get conked on the head and it's really going to hurt.
This is one thing that I was going to wait a while before we talked about. Maybe we'll talk about it now so you can think about it, because we all have to make some kind of plans for ourselves. It's a free concert from now on. That doesn't mean that anything goes. What that means is we're going to put the music up here for free. Now, let's face the situation. We've had thousands and thousands of people come here today. Many, many more than we knew or even dreamt or thought would be possible. We're going to need each other to help each other.
On August 15, 1969, 450,000 people from all over the United States converged on Max Husiger's farm in Bethel, New York. Little did these young people know that this event, which was billed as the Woodstock Music and Art Fair in Aquarian Exposition, was destined to make musical history and would also come to symbolize the energy of an entire generation. This three-day music festival that has come to be called Woodstock marks the coming of age for rock and roll. The music that had grown out of the raw energy and emotion of black blues and the down-home, working-class mentality of folk and country music had gone electric and had been seized by a restless, rebellious, and high-spirited generation of baby boomers.
Never before had so many top-rated musical acts assembled to share one stage. Some were well-established performers: Joan Baez, Ravi Shankar, Tim Hardin, Sly and the Family Stone, and then there were the new and upcoming artists destined for greatness: the Grateful Dead, Santana, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. Many of these groups were spawned by the psychedelic scene that had blossomed the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. But the social and political events that surrounded these 3 days of peace and music transcended this one event. The late 60s were a time of experimentation and self-expression. Drug use, especially marijuana, was on the rise. Dr. Timothy Leary from Harvard University had many young people convinced that LSD would liberate their minds. The development of hassle-free birth control pills liberated their sexual desires. And most important were the sheer numbers. Twice as numerous as their parents, teenaged Americans formed a distinct, self-conscious culture which exerted tremendous political and economic power.
All right. As a result, this generation of young people began to believe that they could change the world. Now, not everybody agreed on exactly what the change should look like, but there was wide agreement among the generation that the established where mom doubtfully stayed home while dad in his business suit keeps the military-industrial complex in full swing was bad. What some fought to change the status quo, while others chose to escape or drop out through the purple haze of drug use, communal living, or simply by looking and acting as differently from their parents as they possibly could.
Before we look too closely at the Woodstock generation as a power to be reckoned with in society, let's take a step back in time. Neither the idea that passionate, like-minded people could change their world, nor the rock music that broadcast this philosophy was invented out of nothing in the late 60s. In fact, one of the most direct influences of this generation was the civil rights movement of the early 60s, which, much thanks to Martin Luther King Jr. and his followers, the entire world watched blacks in America respond to hundreds of years of oppression with peaceful, organized, and effective protest.
Who would forget the famous March on Washington in August of 1963, where 250,000 demonstrators demanded jobs, civil rights, and racial justice? And who would forget the clarion call of King's speech? The rock music of the 60s and beyond also owes a huge debt to the music of Black Americans. The roots of nearly all successful American and British rock bands are connected somehow to the blues and gospel singers who were emerging at the beginning of the 20th century. Robert Johnson, Billie Holiday, Puddy Ledbetter, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, James Brown. The list goes on and on. One of the most influential of all was a young man named McKinley Morganfield, also known as Muddy Waters, who traveled from Louisiana Delta North to Chicago with an electric guitar, a powerful deep voice, and a burning passion for his music to be heard. While his music and lyrics were usually very personal in nature, they always pushed the boundaries for everyone. Coining in the phrase, like a rolling stone, Muddy Waters asserted that he would do things his way and would not be stopped by anyone.
Someday, baby, you ain't gonna inspiration for activists in the 60s was the labor movement of the early 20th century in America. By the mid-60s, workers had benefited greatly from the struggles of miners, farmers, construction workers, and factory workers, and all sorts of labor organizations. This thing we take for granted today, safety laws, the minimum working wage, the 40-hour work week, all stem from the fierce struggle between laborers and management. A Swedish immigrant named Joe Hill was a symbol of this struggle. Joe Hill came to the U.S. at the age of 10 and worked at dozens of odd jobs in the fields, mines, and docks. More importantly, he came to know the poor people who toiled in dangerous mining and agriculture jobs for low pay. Joe Hill became an outspoken member of the radical labor group Industrial Workers of the World. His most important contributions to the labor movement were his simple folk songs, which helped inform and inspire his fellow workers across the country. He set the passion of idealism and rebellion to music. Joe Hill was convicted and executed for murder in 1915 in a questionable case in Utah, which served to immortalize him in the eyes of labor activists throughout the country. Many musical artists in the 20th century who boldly spoke out for the common person, Woody Guthrie, Bob Dylan, John Lennon, viewed Joe Hill as a forefather to their art. Recognition of that legacy came at Woodstock through the voice of Joan Baez. Rather than sing about the controversial war in Vietnam, which seemed to have stolen everyone's attention, she offered to sing about a song about an individual, his spirit, and his determination to speak out. The song, written by poet Alfred Hayes, was I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill.
Joan Baez had played an active role in many organizations' fight against oppression. Women also began to consider the oppression and discrimination they themselves faced. From the labor and civil rights movements, they had learned the techniques of direct action, political pressure, and the use of media, and they began to use these techniques to gain a more equal role in American life. However, feminism was not born in the 60s. The term feminism was first used in 1895 to describe the philosophy of political, economic, and social equality for women. Women had been working since the 1800s for the right to vote and other legal rights such as child custody rights, property rights, rights to their income, and legal protection from physical abuse. By the beginning of the 1960s, almost half of all women held jobs, but the average woman was paid 63 cents for every dollar a man made. By 1973, the average for women's pay had dropped to 59 cents. This inequity came about in spite of increased numbers of women going to college. Inequalities in pay, combined with discrimination in hiring and in promoting, created a growing sense of frustration among women.
The civil rights movement had provided women with a powerful legal tool to begin challenging the discrimination they faced. Ironically, in an effort to kill the Civil Rights Act of 1964, opponents added an amendment to outlaw discrimination on the basis of gender, thinking it would make the legislation look ridiculous. To the surprise of civil rights opponents, both the bill and the amendment were passed. Spurred by Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, women also began to meet with other women to explore their own lives and support each other as they challenged the status quo in their homes, on the job, and in society, seeking more respect and equal treatment. In 1966, 28 women, including Betty Friedan, created NOW, the National Organization of Women, to fight for their goal of achieving equality for women. NOW took on everything from fair pay and equal job opportunities to the media and the false images of women it presented. NOW's membership has grown from its original 28 members to over 280,000 members today. In 1972, journalist Gloria Steinem and others founded Miss Magazine. It was devoted to feminist issues and provided women with an alternate viewpoint from traditional women's magazines like Good Housekeeping. Miss Magazine, NOW, and others in the women's movement helped to bring about a significant shift in attitudes about women and their role in society.
Like the women's movement, the environmental movement had roots in the progressive era of the late 1800s and early 1900s. Inspired by the writings of naturalist John Muir, Congress established Yellowstone as the nation's first national park in 1872.
Yosemite National Park was established in California in 1890. President Teddy Roosevelt added more than 200 million acres to the federal park system, and New Deal programs like the CCC put people back to working by planting trees and doing other kinds of conservation work.
The modern environmental movement sprang from the work of marine biologist Rachel Carson. Published in 1962, her book, Silent Spring, led the attack against the use of chemical pesticides like DDT, which threatened the survival of birds and fish by poisoning the food chain. Rachel Carson's work reawakened the general public to the realization that people, plants, and animals are all a part of the same ecosystem, and that what we did to the environment, we were doing to ourselves.
Around the time of Woodstock, Joni Mitchell, a popular songwriter, released the song Big Yellow Taxi, urging listeners to think hard about society's impact on the environment, or else they'll pave paradise and put up a parking lot.
Well, come on, all these instruments. I'm putting these in the band. Got myself in a caravan. Hold on. 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. Well, it ain't no time to wonder why. We're all going to die. Come on, General, that's too fast. Your legs can't. Gotta go out and get no dress. You only can come here to win. 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. Well, it ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. Come on, father, do what I command. Get the boys up to the end. Come on, father, don't hesitate. On your block, on in the luck. 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. Well, it ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. All right.
With the Environmental Defense Fund's successful federal court case banning the case of DDT, the environment movement grew from local grassroots efforts to a nationwide movement. In response, the federal government created the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. Wisconsin's own governor and U.S. Senator Gaylord Nelson created the first Earth Day in 1970 to serve as a yearly reminder of environmental conservation efforts. Like the women's movement, the efforts of many individuals and environmental organizations significantly changed attitudes and behaviors with regard to conservation and protection of the environment. It should be noted that none of these movements nor the counterculture of the late 60s was a monolithic, single, unified effort. Like today, young people sought many different ways to achieve their identity and self-expression. These included campaigning for young idealistic leaders like John F. Kennedy, joining drug-free communes, and working for a variety of social causes through church and community groups and Peace Corps. But by the mid-1960s, U.S. foreign policy in Vietnam provided the catalyst that would unify the younger generation. On February 11, 1965, the first sustained bombing raids against the North Vietnamese by U.S. forces were ordered by President Lyndon Johnson, and on March 8, 1965, President Johnson sent the first U.S. combat troops to Vietnam.
We do not want an expanding struggle with consequences that no one can foresee, nor will we bluster or bully or flaunt our power. but we will not surrender. And we will not retreat. We intend to convince the communists that we cannot be defeated by force of arms or by superior power. I have asked the commanding general, General Westmoreland, what more he needs to meet this mounting aggression. He has told me, and we will meet his needs.
With the escalation of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam conflict and the looming specter of the draft, the various factions of young Americans began to rally under one banner and one motto: stop the war, get out now. As U.S. involvement in the war grew, so did opposition to it at home. At first it was small and well-contained, limited primarily to polite discourse on college campuses, but it certainly gave young writers and musicians an issue on which to focus their artistic efforts. Folk singers like Phil Ochs, Pete Seeger, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joanne Baez, and Bob Dylan drew heavily on the tradition of one of America's most famous protest singers, Woody Guthrie, to make their stand against the ills of established American society and specifically the war of Vietnam. One of the most famous protest songs was Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind, with the lines like, how many times must the cannonballs fly before they are forever banned, but possibly the song that most typifies the satiric plight of the anti-war movement was the song that Country Joe McDonald sang to kick off the Woodstock Music and Art Fair.
The first massive student protest erupted at the University of California in Berkeley in 1964. The Berkeley Free Speech Movement organized a sit-in to protest administrative restrictions on political activity on campus. The demonstration resulted in the arrest of 800 protesters. By 1966, the anti-war movement had gained tremendous momentum. On March 25th and 26th, huge protests occurred in 7 different U.S. cities. The New York event alone drew 25,000 protesters. By October of 1967, a demonstration by the National Mobilization Against the War drew nearly 100,000 protesters to Washington, where 647 were arrested attempting to exercise the Pentagon. In 1968, over 3,000 campus protests occurred. Fueled by the elimination of the college deferment, which had allowed young men who were enrolled in college to escape being drafted into military service, college campuses across the country became hotbeds of war protests. Organizations like Students for Democratic Society, the Youth International Party, or Yippies, and the Underground Weathermen took hold, while dynamic leaders like Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman, Phil and Dan Berrigan, and even Dr. Benjamin Spock traveled the country brashly criticizing the U.S. government and demanding the immediate withdrawal from Vietnam.
On most campuses, students responded with a variety of demonstrations such as rallies, marches, speeches, sit-ins, draft card burnings, the takeover of administrative buildings, and all-out strikes, refusing to go to class, and other student-sponsored activities. No campus in the country was more active and violent in its opposition to the war than the University of Wisconsin right here in Madison. Clashes between student activists, police, National Guardsmen were a frequent occurrence. As the police and National Guard used increased force, riot gear, tear gas, nightclubs to break up protests, many students abandoned their ideals of peace and love and retaliated with anger and aggression. Storefronts on State Street were often targets of vandalism.
Many people during our modern era have glorified the Vietnam days by promoting how fantastic the Woodstock counterculture movement was. The viewpoint is biased in that it forgets to tell the story of the silent majority. During the mid to late 60s, there was a silent majority of Americans who strongly supported the United States government's enforcement of its containment policy. Many who look back on the 1960s as an era of peace and protest forget that the majority of the democratically elected government of the United States supported fighting the war in Vietnam. Many of the senior members of our society had fought World War II, a war which had threatened the security of the entire world. They also forget several other key factors that made a silent majority worry that the war in Vietnam was serious enough to send our military in to contain communism. For example, Joseph Stalin shut down Eastern Europe, enacting an Iron Curtain. He actually had shut down the road to Berlin, forcing a standoff between the East and West over Germany's 1949, the Communist Revolution under Chairman Mao Zedong was successful at deposing our ally Chiang Kai-shek and ending our friendly alliance with China. In 1950, the North Koreans invaded South Korea, causing the USA to become involved with continuing the spread of communism there.
And in the late 1950s, Cuba, under Fidel Castro, had a communist revolution, causing many in the United States to fear that we were in danger just off our coasts. There was truly a threat to the majority of Americans who supported our military efforts in Vietnam. The communists had proven over the late 40s, 50s, and 60s that they indeed were interested in growing their influence. And the counter-war movement failed to recognize a real threat, and that 58,000 Americans had lost their lives trying to protect the world from falling dominoes that indeed could have reached our shores. As in the case in Cuba proved, they were only 90 miles away. Finally, Richard Nixon, who coined the term silent majority as the people who elected him in 1968, attempted to end the war. First, he drew down the number of U.S. forces in Vietnam in an attempt to turn the fighting over to the Southern Vietnamese Army, known as Vietnamization. Secondly, he tried to win in Vietnam by invading Cambodia in late 1969 and 1970 in order to cut off supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This outraged many in the counterculture because, in their view, he was expanding the war. However, in the view of the silent majority, he was attempting to cut off supplies that were allowing the communists to win the war in Vietnam. In the end, Nixon's plan, Vietnamization, to turn the war over to the Southern Vietnamese Army and cut off supplies to the Viet Cong were unsuccessful. The Northern Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong proved to be too strong of an adversary, and the United States would eventually have to withdraw from Vietnam in defeat.
Meanwhile, the U.S. casualties in Vietnam began to mount and U.S. involvement became even deeper. Nightly news reports chronicled atrocities and body counts and hard-to-understand tragedies and rationals. The generation gap widened more in 1968 with the assassination of first Martin Luther King and then Bobby Kennedy. With Bobby Kennedy's death, the Democratic Party was left torn apart on civil rights issues and the Vietnam War. Thousands of protesters converged on Chicago in the summer of 1968, the site of Democratic National Convention. Chicago's Mayor Daley erected fences and barbed wire around the convention center, and he ordered police to clear out demonstrators. The confrontation that ensued exploded into a melee of tear gas, clubs, and stampeding protesters. As news cameras rolled recording the violence used to break up the demonstration, protesters chanted, "The whole world is watching."
President Richard Nixon was elected in November that year, vowing to expedite the end of U.S. involvement in Vietnam through the Vietnamization of the war. In other words, increasing the role of the South Vietnamese army. As U.S. troops were being withdrawn, Nixon spread the U.S. bombing runs into Cambodia and Laos, the last-ditch effort to win the war by knocking out the supply route to the Viet Cong rebels in the south. The bombing of Cambodia and Laos triggered another wave of protests at home. Mistrust among all factions of American society spread like wildfire, as hope for a peace settlement based on a clear-cut victory by the U.S. forces was fading. The government, the politicians, the media, young activists, the older generation that had emerged triumphant during World War II, all began to question each other's integrity, morality, and patriotism. The optimism and idealism of the Woodstock generation had turned into bitterness, anger, mistrust, and hatred.
On May 4th, 1970, an event occurred that marked the turning point in anti-war movement in America. The invasion of Cambodia by American troops had intensified the militancy of campus protests when tragedy struck in Ohio. On the campus of Kent State University, National Guard troops had been called out by the governor to subdue a group of student protesters. As tension mounted, several young guardsmen, no older than the students they were expected to control, opened fire on the unarmed protesters and bystanders. When the shooting ended, 9 students were injured and 4 lay dead.
One among hundreds of protests taking place on college campuses around the country that weekend, sparked by President Nixon's televised announcement to widen the Vietnam War by launching airstrikes inside the borders of neutral Cambodia. Fully armed but inexperienced National Guard units were put into service to quell the demonstrations. Suddenly, the smell of smoke and the sound of gunfire split the air. A local reporter witnessed the whole tragic event.
At the request of the Portage County prosecutor, an injunction has been imposed by County Judge Albert Karras, barring all persons from the KSU campus except those specifically authorized by the Ohio National Guard. The injunction requires all students living on campus to depart as soon as possible and at the latest by 12 noon tomorrow. At this point, the majority of students have left the campus and many are awaiting rides from parents and friends. The injunction has been imposed as a result of this weekend's campus disorders. This afternoon, 4 persons, including 2 women, were shot and killed on the campus during renewed demonstrations involving hundreds of students.
Members of the National Guard units at Kent State had fired loaded weapons without warning into crowds of anti-war protesters. A similar incident 10 days later claimed 2 more lives at Jackson State University in Mississippi. In the fevered aftermath of the shootings, a presidential commission was formed and concluded that the National Guard's action of firing into the crowd was unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable. The war